The views and opinions expressed in this program do not necessarily represent those of Natural Bridges Media or KSQD's staff, volunteers, or underwriters.
Hello and welcome to Talk of the Bay. I am your host, and with me today is Richard King and via internet, Mallory Hoffbeck and Mia Hines. Richard J. King is the author of 5 books of nonfiction about our relationship with the global ocean, including most recently, Sailing Alone, A History. He has also written Ahab's Rolling Sea, A Natural History of Moby Dick, which was lauded in Science, Nature, and American Scholar. He also wrote Lobster, which was acclaimed by the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, and The Devil's Cormorant in Natural History, which was shortlisted for the ASLE Creative Book Award and rated as one of the top 5 science books of 2013 by Library Journal. Rich is also the author of a variety of popular and scholarly articles, reviews, and interviews in a range of magazines and academic journals. He has illustrated 2 children's books, What is a Sea Dog? And Women and the Sea, and also Ruth. He writes and illustrates a quarterly column titled Animals in Sea History for Sea History magazine, was a series editor for Seafaring America, and he co-edits the online reference Searchable Sea Literature. Rich earned his Ph.D. in Writing and Sea Literature from the University of St. Andrews. He has been sailing on tall ships for over 25 years, traveling throughout the North Atlantic and Pacific Oceans as both a teacher and a sailor. He is a visiting associate professor with the Sea Education Association of Woods Hole, Massachusetts, a lecturer at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies in Monterey, and a research associate with the Literature Department at UC Santa Cruz. Richard King, welcome to Talk of the Bay.
Thanks a lot, Len. Appreciate you having me here.
Thank you for coming in. Mallory Hoffbeck is a recent graduate of the Middlebury Institute in Monterey with a master's in environmental policy, specializing in marine resource management. At Middlebury, she worked as a researcher and writer with the Center for the Blue Economy, and as a researcher and administrative assistant with the study of environmental Arctic change. She's from Oregon and got her bachelor's in politics and government at Pacific University. Mallory Hoffbeck, welcome. And Mia Hines is a rising senior at Grinnell College, pursuing a computer science major and statistics minor. She has obtained rigorous IT internships, attended competitive summer fellowships and programs, and developed award-winning projects. However, what Mia is truly passionate about is technology research. Over the past few years, she served as summer research assistant at Brown University and Massachusetts Institute of Technology. This fall, she is working on an environmental justice project with the MIT Media Lab. After graduating in spring 2024, she plans to pursue a Ph.D. in computer science or a related field. Mia Hines, welcome.
Thank you so much.
Well, last year, you all worked together on a research project deciphering and transcribing the ship log of Captain Robert Joy that he recorded during a 3.5-year whaling voyage from 1835 to 1839. It was his 7th and final voyage. And you co-authored an article about that research. But before I ask you about that, I'd like to catch up on what you've been doing since then. And I'd like to start with you, Mallory. What have you been working on since you did the research for Captain Joy's last voyage?
So that was during my last semester of my master's program at the Middlebury Institute. So since then, Rich and I actually have been on a sailing trip, which we might talk about later. But yeah, with the Sea Education Association, and we just returned from that a few weeks ago.
Wow. And where did you go on that voyage?
We sailed from Hawaii to Fiji for about 6 weeks.
Wow. Okay. Yes, we've got to learn more about that. And Maya, what have you been up to since working on the research for Captain Joy's last voyage?
Yeah, so environmental studies is not like my first like major, but it is an interest of mine. So I this summer I worked at MIT on an environmental justice project. I'm very outside of whaling law books, but I still use some of those skills. Like I did a lot of map work, and I did that for this project as well. So yeah, so MIT, and now I'm back at Grinnell. So yeah.
Great. And Richard, Mallory said you were on the same voyage with her. Can you tell us what you've been up to in the last several months?
Sure, that's right. Right after we finished that project and published the article, Mallory and I and 31 other crew members boarded a ship in Oahu, and we sailed all the way to Fiji, and with no port stops, about 5 weeks at sea by way of the Pacific Remote Islands Marine National Monument. We had a little bit of a sighting of Howland and Baker just a couple miles away, two small uninhabited islands. But basically this was a voyage of oceanography with students and researchers and sampling the ocean, looking at marine protected areas, and learning how to sail a ship and live at sea as a community.
Wow, sounds great. And was this a sailing ship or a more typical kind of motorized vessel?
Yeah, it's a little bit of a hybrid. It is. This is out of the Woods Hole, Massachusetts, the Sea Education Association, and they run two ships. They have steel hulls, but they also have masts, so we can operate entirely under sail, but we also will use our engine to make way in a particular direction that we want to, because we have a pretty rigorous scientific schedule. And even though it's a traditional sailing ship, we also have really advanced oceanographic equipment, so we can put gear down over 3,000 meters to sample water underneath the surface.
Wow, great. So many adventures to dive into. But I'd like to explore first what you learned from working with Captain Joy's logbook. He made daily entries on a voyage that lasted, I think, 40 months and 10 days, dating from the fall of 1835 to the spring of 1839 as captain of the ship Roman. And the year they departed New England, at least 214 other whaling ships sailed from New England ports. In the course of the voyage, the whalers on the Roman killed and boiled out the oil from 90 sperm whales and injured another 40 that got away, but may have died from their injuries. What struck you about Captain Joy's chronicle of his 3.5-year-long whaling expedition? And I'd like to start with you, Mallory.
Yeah, so one of the things that's particularly interesting about that logbook are the observations that he made about other marine life that he saw at sea in addition to the whales. So in our article, we've included some of his drawings, his paintings of seabirds, especially seabirds, but other marine life that he observed. So it's really kind of a remarkable document, very valuable recording of what he saw at sea. And he also recorded weather conditions as well. So lots of data that can be gathered from that.
Yeah, and I gather that what you started with was like a scan of his original handwritten log. Is that right?
That's right.
Yeah, so you had to make sense of his writing, and he used a lot of abbreviations, and he spelled things in antique ways sometimes, and then he filled in the margins with drawings. So from all of that, is that unusual? I mean, are other ships' logs as detailed? And I'll ask you about that, Richard, because I think you know more about the history of ship logs.
Yeah, thanks, Len. And it might be helpful to listeners to step back a little bit and say that around this time, at the height of traditional American whaling, when they're undersailing ships, just under sail, rowing boats to get whales, they can only get a couple species of whales that are slow enough to catch. Sperm whales, right whales, bowheads, maybe occasional humpback. And around this time, from the 1830s to 1850s, right when Captain Joy is out sailing, this is the height of American whaling, where we have sometimes over 600 ships a year that are out there, which means that we're talking about 8,000 to 10,000, mostly young people, that are out at sea every single year, out on the surface of the ocean day after day, and they're often not stopping, just like we did this summer, but even longer, sometimes 4 or 5 months at sea without a single port stop. Every single day, 2 or 3 young men up there aloft looking for whales. And so we have this extraordinary data set of observations of all of these people every single day scanning carefully the surface of the ocean to try to see what's out there. And in that process, we have these records, these transcriptions, very business-like logbooks, just like mariners keep today. But every single day, Captain Joy was writing down what he saw. And Captain Joy's logbook was exceptional in that he was really a polymath. He described a tsunami in Oahu. He described just like Mallory said, birds and fish and the weather, and he wrote all this down, but then he also did these great illustrations and diagrams of shorelines. And so it was a typical journal, one of thousands that still exist, but Captain Joy's was pretty special in that he really observed so many different things and did a lot of illustrations.
It's amazing. And I gather that ship's logs are, actively in use. Like there's people making use of these old ship's logs to try to create a picture of what was going on in the world back in that era of whaling, which kind of, peaked from 1830 to 1860. And Captain Joy was continually recording his latitude and longitude. You were able to map the ship's travels. And I want to ask you, Maya, about that, because you mentioned you worked on mapping. What did you work on that process of decoding his locational sightings and setting that on a map?
It was interesting. It was his log entries were helpful in the way that they always ended with the longitude and latitude. But of course, this is this long period of time, so it's not going to be perfect. So we had problems with missing longitude and latitudes. When he was in port, he doesn't give a longitude and latitude. Sometimes he cites like a nearby island that we had to pull from. So a lot of different data errors had to be corrected with all this immense amount of data. But it was so fun and a big learning experience for sure.
And were there any surprises or puzzles in the route that they took for hunting whales?
Yeah, so for example, if there's other research that shows that there's no migration patterns, or that's what's being recently pulled from logbooks or from under information, that there's research that there's very little migration patterns of sperm whales. But Captain Joy always had a very consistent pattern. So he would be up in one place in the spring and then be another place in the fall, and would do that consecutively over the years, which was very interesting because it kind of gives us lights, maybe not on the science of sperm whales, but what did the people that were hunting sperm whales thought of the migration patterns? Was there something that we're missing in science that they know that we don't know, or we've estimated that wrong? So it was just really interesting following that thought process and looking at that data.
So here's this ship full of people, I gather either all or nearly all men, right? They set sail from New England. They stop in the Cape Verde archipelago, presumably to stock up on water and other supplies. And then they spend most of their time at sea in the Pacific, with the Hawaiian Islands being their primary resupply port. And I wondered, was there any information in the logs about the places they stopped, about the environment of those places or the people in those places?
Yeah. I remember specifically from Hawaii, he recounts a tsunami and kind of the response that people on land had from that event. He recounts kind of how afraid everyone was and how they reacted to the tsunami. So that's one of the most memorable accounts he gives of people on land. Rich and Maya, do you have anything to add to that?
Did he observe it from shipboard or from the shore?
It must have been when they were anchored. So I'm not sure if he was on board or if he was on shore when the tsunami happened. He must have been on shore, I'm guessing.
Yeah, and I could add, well, first I should say that Maya was being pretty humble about the creation of that map. So she pretty much taught herself software to be able to create this map from the logbook, and also designed a whole spreadsheet. We set up a spreadsheet to put in our latitude and longitude, the sighting of whales, different marine life, and so Maya was really our guide. And before I forget, I want to mention some of our other co-authors on the study. We had a bunch of other students that were involved. And so also helping out was Kripa Bonzal and Carter Myers-Brown and Finn Warner and Karin Kunwar that all helped us. It was a really small class, and it was really quite challenging, I think, for the students. And Maya and Mallory can mention, I just sort of came in and said, hey, we're doing this project, and we're involved with, and we were doing it with the New Bedford Whaling Museum, Mark Prochnick and Michael Dyer. They gave us this project, and we're delivering this transcription to them. And I think one of the, talking about the ports is a really great question, because in some ways the document is so rich, it has so much, but it's also pretty limited because we know almost nothing about the people that were on board. We don't have a crew list on this voyage. Many other voyages do have crew lists. And so he stopped in Lahaina for quite a while, which was, we were sort of all thinking about, over the last couple weeks with the fires. They were walking on shore in Lahaina. That was a major whaling port. They were anchored right there for, multiple times on many of his voyages. But he would get to port and describe the ships that went in and out, but very little about the people that went there. He wouldn't give the names of the crew that he boarded, and we know that he brought Pacific Islanders on board. He brought Cape Verdeans on board. He would have had free blacks. He would have had Native Americans from New England, all on board in this very diverse crew with only, maybe 25, 30 people on board. And we don't have their voices at all. We really just have this very business-like document, which gives us so much in terms of marine environmental history, but not as much in terms of the social dynamics on board.
Yeah, and that reminds me, I reread Moby Dick a few years ago. And one of the fascinating things for me was just how multi-ethnic the makeup of the crew was in Melville's story. People from pretty much literally all over the world, or at least people from, shoreline areas all over the world. And this is parallel to what you do know, which isn't much, but what you do know about Captain Joy's voyage with the Roman is that you had people from many different places, and they obviously had to eat together and share work together and be on the same ship for months at a time together. And it's an interesting microcosm of what now we would call a diverse society, a culturally and racially diverse society, which a lot of people still is still kind of an alien experience to a lot of people. So the fact that kind of thing was going on whaling ships all through the first half of the 19th century is pretty amazing. I mean, especially when you consider that we didn't, matches were patented in 1838. So most people, they didn't, they had to light everything with flint and steel. They're burning whale oil or candles. There's no electricity. There's no telegraph. There's no cell phones. I mean, this is a world where people are technologically pretty much on an equal footing, and but coming from very different cultures. And so, I think it's fun to speculate about. And perhaps I have some questions for you later, Richard, about your book about the natural history of Moby Dick. But it would be interesting to know more about how all those people did live and work together. And Maya, I wanted to return to the map. First of all, let our listeners know, if you'd like to read this article, Captain Joy's Last Voyage, it is in Earth Island Journal, and I believe that you can at least get snippets of those articles online. I don't know if you can get the whole thing. You can get all of it. Yeah, so great. So if you do a search for Earth Island Journal, I don't know the specific website name, but if you do a search, it'll pop up, and you can look at it. And I believe it was in the April or May issue, but I don't recall exactly. but it is findable, and it was the cover story. So if they show the covers, you'll find it fast. And the map is beautiful. I mean, the map shows, so, compliments to you, Mia, for all your work in making that happen. It not only shows their route, but it shows every sighting of a sperm whale, every captured, every site where they captured sperm whales, every spot where they shot a sperm whale but lost it. And it's a really amazing picture of a 3.5-year effort to capture as many of these animals as they possibly could, and fill up the hold with oil, which was by inflation adjusted dollars, whale oil was worth way more than petroleum oil is today. So it gives you a little pause to think about how precious this particular thing was that they were in the process of getting. So, Mallory, you mentioned that the logbooks contain a lot of weather and ocean observations. And is that information useful in understanding how the climate is changing?
Yes. So by my understanding, those would be typical things to record just for practical purposes as they're sailing. But they do also have that value later on for oceanographic researchers. And we also, for our project, gave our data or worked with Carolyn Umenhofer from the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute to share our data for a project on historic observations of weather, if that's right. Yes.
Great. So there are other researchers then making use of this information from whalers' logs. What is the resource? I mean, how many whalers' logs are there out there that one could draw information about that era from? Richard, do you have a sense of that?
Sure, yeah. We're talking about tens of thousands of voyages, and maybe about 10% of those are still findable, and most of that data has been collected. Very early on, even in the 1850s, researchers were recognizing, like, hey, all of these logbooks are pretty useful. And so the United States Navy, Matthew Fontaine Maury, and others sort of identified these logbooks and said, we need to sort of compile this information. And originally it was compiled just for navigation, to say, all right, when's the best time to go around Cape Horn? When is it going to be the safest time to go around Cape Hatteras? Things like that. But then they started to say, hey, let's try to all get together and work together and find out the best place to go find whales. And so that was happening even in the 1850s and 1860s, collectively contributing these logbooks to put together this information. And that's why sort of Mia's mapping was so interesting, in that once we sort of entered all the locations, put the map up there, we were able to look at Captain Joy's route for the voyage before and the voyage before that. And we found that, just like anybody would do, he pretty much went the same route and went to the same places where he felt comfortable and had caught whales before, even though this didn't really match the sort of marine ecology of sperm whales. He'd found whales in that location, and so he went back there that season. But what was super interesting that we found is that the voyage that we saw, it took him 3.5 years. The year before, it took him 2.5 years. The year before that, almost the exact same route, it only took him 2 years. And so by that third voyage, he started to be like, wait a second, are we starting to deplete the whales? Even in the 1830s, he was starting to wonder about whale populations.
Yeah, and you even quoted his log where he wrote, this was a couple years into the voyage, he wrote, saw finbacks, jumpers, and porpoises, but no sperm whales. Oh dear, where are all the whales gone to? Are they killed off? And that's from 1838. But, as many, even though a lot of whales were killed, I guess the estimates are during that era, maybe 5,000 whales a year would be killed. That's a relatively small number compared to when whaling was still active in the 20th century in the 1960s. And do you have a a sense of those numbers?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things that we always try to make clear when you're saying a very basic question of like, how are the whales doing today? Or how were they doing 150 years ago, 250 years ago, 350 years ago? The first thing to ask is kind of, which whales are you talking about? Because there's a big range of whale species. And then also sort of what strategy or what was the kind of hunting like? And so traditional American whaling and a couple other countries were involved. Like I mentioned, we're pretty much limited by only going under sail, hand tools, rowing, and so they could really only catch a couple of those species. When you start to move into the 20th century into a more industrial whaling, then you're moving on to iron hulls, stern ramps, hydraulics, explosive harpoons, and the ability to catch up to any whale species, the rorquals, the finbacks, the blue whales. That's why in that quote you said, he said, oh yeah, saw finbacks. They don't even bother to try to hunt them because they're just too fast. So they just see them from afar. So by the time we get into the 20th century, in terms of sperm whales, they're probably catching about 20,000 a year, but for a much shorter period of time, just for about 1920 until we move into the International Whale Moratorium in the 1980s. And so today, very few sperm whales are being hunted.
Wow. And from what we know, they're extremely intelligent animals. I mean, they are more like porpoises and orcas, dolphins, than they are like the baleen whales in terms of the sophistication of their social relations and their intelligence. And as I think you made a reference to this, Maya, that what researchers think we know now about them is that they're roving around nomadically chasing their primary prey. They're not necessarily migrating on a seasonal basis. And so I wondered if you'd care to talk about that a little bit, either you, Maya or Mallory, about the sperm whales and your sense. I mean, here we are, in an era when everybody loves whales, right? But you're reading a detailed account of people just killing them, and sometimes the process of harpooning and landing a sperm whale so you could cut it up and boil it down for its oil it's pretty gruesome. So I wondered if you could talk about your take on that and what your sense of what you learned about the whales was from going through this log.
So yeah, it was super interesting, and it was also very terrifying to start off with, just to read about cutting and boiling and stabbing, and there's also kind of gruesome pictures at times of blood. Captain Joy draws when he kills a whale, he draws a whale upside down and blood going out his blowhole. So it's very gruesome. So, but by the time you enter 50 pages, you get used to it. But I think it's super interesting about this whole discussion of whaling logbooks and looking at our perspective now is also the science part of it. So we understand how whales can hear better, or their sonic sound underwater. And then it's so then you ask yourself, how could they get harpooned if they heard the boat coming? Or how did this happen because of that? So it's really interesting to have all that research that's coming out right now about whales, and how can we apply that to the historical context that we saw with whale hunting. So that's where I get fascinated by.
Mallory, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, for me, it's pretty interesting to think about, kind of like you mentioned, how our perceptions of whales have changed, because with that aspect of the details of how they hunt them, I'm not sure that it's terribly different from hunting any other animal, but it really kind of made me think about how we think about different species and how our understandings can really change over time about which animals we are more interested in or less interested in. So that was a really interesting thing for me.
Yeah. Well, we're going to take a really short break. We'll be right back with my guests, Mallory Hoffbeck, Mia Hines, and Richard King, right after this. Don't touch that dial. Welcome back to Talk of the Bay. I'm your host, Len Bier, and if you're just tuning in, my guests are Richard King, Mallory Hoffbeck, and Mia Hines, they have varied career paths, but they did something together. They worked on a research project to go through the sailing log of a whaling ship from the 1800s and to pull all the data out of that, map the journey, and share that data with other researchers, because the ship's logs from these whaling ships, of which there were thousands of journeys during the 1800s, particularly the first half of the century, were incredibly detailed and had observations of weather, sea life, and occasionally also the land life of their ports of call. So I wanted to come back to asking you a little bit about being at sea. Richard and Mallory, you were both together on a sea education voyage. I believe this is under the auspices of Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute, or at least affiliated in some loose manner. So I wanted to find out more about what that experience was like, what was being learned by the people on board, and a little bit, maybe just perhaps you can give our listeners some insight into life at sea, which I think most of us have a very limited exposure to.
Yeah, I'll start us off and then I'll turn it over to Mallory. Sea Education Association in Woods Hole, Massachusetts has been around since 1971. As I mentioned, running those two ships. And a typical sea semester program is 4 to 6 weeks on shore, studying in Woods Hole, and then going to sea either in the Atlantic or the Pacific for 4 to 6 weeks. And that can involve studying oceanography, designing their own projects, but also studying the humanities, whether it's conservation and management or environmental communication or history and culture. And when we go to sea, we all go together. The ship's running 24/7. We're stopping for sampling. We have a cruise plan. We're trying to match the students' projects, but also we're cleaning all the time. And we have stewards that are the hardest working people on the ship. And we're running 24/7. And this summer, I asked Mallory to come join us, and Mallory had not been on a ship before. And so I think she can give a great perspective of what it's like to go to sea for the first time.
It was kind of a remarkable experience, just both in terms of how exciting things are and how different, and then also the kind of mundane things of getting used to living on the ship, like Rich mentioned, cleaning lots of things and being responsible in watch groups for the ship. So I was on as a teaching assistant, but I also was in a watch group, which means that I worked with the students, and we also had some deck hands on board to run the ship, to take turns taking care of the ship while other people are off watch. So our cruise track, as we said before, was from Hawaii to Fiji. And during all that time, we were at sea, and it was very hot. So that's something that people mentioned a lot in our class blog. But yeah, just getting used to doing that kind of work and being in a totally different environment was a great experience.
How do you keep cool when you're out there?
In some ways, you just don't. That was actually something to think about too, of how like this was on my mind a lot, of how kind of helpless we are to the heat when there's no relief. So we did have one air-conditioned room on board, which was our little science lab, but we're forbidden from congregating in there and heating it up. So it was kind of standing out in the breeze or just dealing with it.
Mm-hmm.
But
Did that give you some empathy maybe for the sailors on these whaling ships who were in somewhat the same region, right?
Yes, for sure. And yeah, for me, I was also thinking about climate change and extreme heat, and kind of feeling that in a situation where I can't just go into some air conditioning. That was a good experience as well.
And while you're on ship, you mentioned that you took turns on certain watches. Did you have times of solitude or very quiet periods when you're out on deck and you're just witnessing what's happening?
Definitely. My favorite position by far on the ship was standing lookout, which is where you just stand in the bow, the very front of the ship, and just watch the horizon for any kind of storms or other ships, which is very rare on our voyage, or marine life or land if we're close to land. But yeah, that's definitely a contemplative time, especially during the night. But as kind of connecting to what we were talking about before with the whaling logbook, thinking about seeing animals at sea, especially whales, that's kind of what everyone's very excited when they're standing on lookout to see. And we saw, by my memory, we saw whales on 3 different occasions, but they were kind of few and far between, with the exception of we saw what we're pretty sure is a pod of sperm whales. So there would be,
Wow.
we can identify them by their spouts, and that would probably be a group of adult females that are all related to each other and juveniles.
Wow, kind of like elephants, where you see a whole group together that's mothers and their offspring, basically. Yeah, interesting. Wow. Wow, and you said that there were times you were on deck in the dark as well. So what's that like when you're out in the middle of the ocean, you're away from city lights? Presumably the ship is not heavily lit. I don't know. How is it to be out where there's no land on the horizon and it's dark?
It's pretty amazing how many stars are visible that you would never be able to see, at least for me, if you live in a fairly urban area. But even if you don't, just it's so dark that I remember there were shooting stars almost every night, and that you would normally not be able to see. So that's pretty remarkable. And just also your eyes can adjust to the darkness. So by moonlight and starlight, you can still see a fair amount of the ocean. And just kind of, especially on our particular cruise track, feeling very alone when there's no one else to see out there.
Yeah, and was that a round trip, or did you end your voyage in Fiji?
We ended in Fiji, so the ship is there now preparing for the next voyage, which is the next group of students will be going from Fiji to New Zealand.
Wow. Okay, how do I sign up? Because it sounds like such a great, it's a way of getting an education about a lot of things that are all connected through that process of being at sea. I mean, it's, you're learning about navigation and I don't know what they call, marine engineering, but obviously what it takes to have a ship that will function in the water and stay afloat for a long period of time. And of course, everything else that you're actually seeking to learn about in the places that, whether it's the marine life or the landfalls that you make. So that sounds like a fantastic educational experience. I did some consulting work for the California, what's it called? California Marine Academy or Maritime Academy, California Maritime Academy. And in speaking to students there, it struck me also that was an amazing opportunity for a really wonderful educational experience. Maya, you didn't get to go. Would you be interested in something like that if the opportunity arose?
Absolutely, I would have gone, but I had a job in Massachusetts. I'm very bummed that I missed out on these beautiful stars and hanging out with these amazing people. Yeah, sounds like an incredible experience. Maybe next time.
Yeah, it's definitely. I know that there's at least a few institutions in the U.S. that have similar programs. So that's encouraging to know that you all were able to participate and that you helped make that happen as a teacher and a teaching assistant. So thank you for sharing that experience. Richard, you mentioned that that some of the climate data is being used in particular ways, and I wondered if you could talk about that a little more.
Yeah, I'll pick up from where Mallory left off in terms of, both the example of sailing on that ship and really thinking about ourselves as a little community and a ship of state, and like you said, Len, thinking about our own energy and the fuel we use and the food we bring aboard and how we refrigerate it and how we cook it. It's a really intense lesson about being a little island out there and how we use our resources and where they come from. But in terms of the whaling logbooks, Mallory mentioned Carolyn Umenhofer at HUI, at Woods Hole Oceanographic, just down the road from Sea Education Association, and also working with Timothy Walker, who is a historian at the University of Massachusetts at Dartmouth. And they've been starting this climate project, which is looking at historic whaling logbooks. And it just, when you go on the ship, it's obviously collaborative, and oceanographers are used to doing collaborative work. But I think one of the things that I'm so excited about this paper and the story that we wrote with Earth Island Journal is it was really so collaborative. All of our students brought all different skills. We had undergrads and grad students. The editors at Earth Island Journal joined us. They came and zoomed in and kind of talked about the process and how to edit the piece. So we were super appreciative of that. And then we got to work with Caroline and Tim. We weren't able in the end to work exactly into their study. We kind of did a little bit of a beta testing of how a different group could work into their study. But the idea is that there just is not a lot of baseline information about what was the ocean like 100 years ago, 300 years ago, 500 years ago. And so when you look at a whaling logbook, the first thing that strikes me, and particularly after a voyage like we just went on, is just the very abundance of marine life out at sea. Every single day, nearly, Captain Joy is saying, saw dolphins, saw fish, saw birds, saw whales. And that just is not happening. And we have a much smaller sample size, but I feel confident enough, and I've spent enough time at sea that I look at these logbooks and just the ocean was a livelier, busier, more populous place in his time. Caroline and Tim at Modern Climate Researchers looked at these logbooks and say, what was the weather like at the latitude of Hawaii or at the equator or at the latitude of Aotearoa, New Zealand in the 1830s? And we don't need to know that it was 15 knots, but we can get a range. And so they're kind of just looking at that relational baseline to say, okay, were there more storms then? Was it windier there? Sometimes Captain Joy would take a water temperature or an air temperature, and so we can get that data too. And so we really get this relational information. When you start to build up hundreds, sometimes thousands of logbooks, you can get a little bit of a picture, and that's why a climate modeler like Caroline can really put this picture together and say, okay, where are we starting from pre-industrial revolution in terms of global weather?
Wow. So this is really filling in the jigsaw puzzle, as it were, of telling us the history of the climate and the history, to some extent, of the ocean itself by being able to go to these detailed logs. And as you said, with literally thousands of whaling ships out and recording these findings, that really amounts to a significant amount of data to work with. So that's amazing work.
It's interesting, too, in that other researchers today are using these logbooks for marine protected areas to say, okay, we've got a marine protected area in this area and we want to make it a reserve, say, for fish. Is that going to serve whales? And maybe if the whales aren't there now, were whales there 150 years ago? Were there 300 years ago? And so that we can design protected areas with the presumed and expectation, perhaps overly hopeful, that whaling populations are going to reemerge and return to pre-industrial levels, and so we can put protections in place for where they were.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, I have some more questions for you, Richard. But before I do that, I wanted to ask both of you, Maya and Mallory, if you had anything else you wanted to share with us about your experience of working on this project, or about what you've learned and where you think you might end up in relation to what you've written about here for this project, going through these whaling logs.
I had a wonderful time. It was great to this whole program. So I want to actually plug Miss Middlebury Institute of International Studies Study Away program from Middlebury College. Because I was in the California Climate Semester program, which they're having again next year. So if you're an undergraduate student and you're interested in learning more about environmental studies or learning more about the history that's occurring in California, I would totally recommend to apply. So just so you know that, or if you know someone that's an undergraduate, tell them about this program. It was really phenomenal. I really enjoy taking all the environmental information that I have and seeing the science outside of technology, but also how can technology apply to that science. So be able to support this project and the mapping work was really cool, and to see how that can really help contextualize a lot of questions that we were having. I really enjoyed. Yeah.
Great. Mallory?
Yeah, for me, I'm kind of going into a career in some kind of management, some kind of environmental policy. And for me, both working on this project and going on the sailing trip that we did this summer have been a particularly good experience in seeing things for myself that I would typically study from my armchair, specifically looking at the logbook so carefully and kind of following what that voyage experienced, and then also going on a voyage myself, have been really good for just gaining some kind of personal experience with things that I normally would just study from kind of afar. So that's been my main takeaway.
Right. The hands-on experience. There's nothing like it. Well, Richard, you wrote a book titled Ahab's Rolling Sea: A Natural History of Moby Dick. And in Herman Melville's novel Moby Dick, which was inspired by Melville's own experience as a crew member on a whaling ship, he tries to describe the taxonomy of whale species, for example, in as much as it was known in his day. And he also goes into the mythology around whales, going way back, as far as, he was able to access that. And occasionally he gives some really beautiful descriptions of some places where where they make stops to resupply or get water or whatever. What were you able to distill from the novel that informs our understanding of life on Earth in the 1800s?
Yeah, one thing that it's pretty amazing that Moby Dick is still popular today, that we're still reading it. When you think about it, here's this, story about some vengeful guy from Nantucket who's just out there killing whales, and it doesn't end well, and yet it is so compelling for so many different reasons, and generation after generation have taken inspiration from the novel. 21st century generations are really thinking about climate change and the marine environment, and Moby Dick even speaks to us about that. And so when we talk about a population baseline of what did the ocean look like in the 1840s and 1850s, Moby Dick actually gives us an extraordinarily good baseline, both in terms of what it was like out there and what did people think about the ocean. What was the perception of the ocean, which is something that both Maya and Mallory talked about. Herman Melville had done the thing. He had worked on 3 different whale ships. He'd been on a whale ship, one voyage for over 14 months. He'd worked on a U.S. naval vessel. He'd worked on a transatlantic merchant ship. He'd been to sea himself for more than very few people today. And then he had also was a huge reader, both of the scientific literature as well as the poetic literature of the time. And so he brings in this very rare perspective of both the hands-on learning, like you said, and the sort of book learning. And so he brings that all together, and he writes a novel that, of course, is fictional, but also is extraordinarily factual in terms of its observation of marine life and the whaling trade. And so what I did, and this was a project of many years, was just took the descriptions to various experts. That includes locally. I live here in Santa Cruz, and I went down to Moss Landing and said, hey, shark experts, this is how Melville describes sharks. What do you take from that? And I was able to go to Aotearoa, New Zealand, and actually go out with a sperm whale researcher and say, hey, sperm whale researcher, this is what Melville wrote. How accurate is this to our understanding today? And what you find time after time is that Melville really was extraordinarily observant, accurate, and representative of the knowledge of his time.
Yeah, and his characters are pretty vital. I mean, they're full of vitality, and they're especially for me, the people who come from indigenous cultures that are his shipmates are especially striking in not only in their personalities, but also their acceptance of their fate as the end of the book happens. Because there is this thing of, Ahab wants to kill that damn whale, but the others are just like, well, whatever destiny brings, it's like, we're going with the program here,
Yeah.
not with Ahab's program, but with the whale's program, or nature's program, you could say. And it's an interesting sort of play of, what do we really revere here? What is our allegiance, and how important is it for us to dominate versus ultimately accepting that we're dominated by nature? And that, to me, that maybe that's a little bit too literary of a discussion, but to me, that was one of the striking things about the way he portrays the different characters in the book. So.
Yeah, no, I think I totally agree with that observation. And if you look at the ending of Moby Dick, basically, spoiler alert,
if you haven't read it,
that, Fish and Ish survive in the end. Fish, Ish being Ishmael,
yes.
The character, and that only because we need somebody to tell the story. And if you look at that ending, it's almost identical to what Rachel Carson writes a full century later to Finish Under the Sea Wind, where the ocean sort of overtakes civilization. It's super interesting. And I love the discussion of Queequeg because, one thing that has sort of reemerged in the times that Moby Dick was written was sort of that understanding of Polynesian excellence and the sort of how for so many millennia they sailed across the entire Pacific. And Queequeg, the Pacific Islander hero in Moby Dick, really is this heroic figure. And Melville has these little moments where he recognizes traditional ecological knowledge. Like there's this one little moment where they see this amorphous white mass right at the surface, and it turns out to be a dead giant squid up on the surface. And the Nantucketers, the Yankee whalers, are totally freaked out by it. They think it's a bad omen. They're like, oh my gosh, let's get out of here as soon as possible. And Queequeg is basically like, you know what? It's just squid. That means we're going to see sperm whales right nearby. And literally in the next scene, indeed, sperm whales arise. And so Melville, recognizing both the diet of sperm whales as well as the knowledge of the Pacific Islanders, that understanding of that diet.
Yeah, which is pretty amazing considering the size of boats that they used and all of it. I mean, that's a whole... We need another program. We'll come back and talk about Pacific Islander knowledge of the sea. Richard, you chronicled your own solo voyage across the Atlantic and the history of others who made long solo voyages in your new book, Sailing Alone. I believe that's your newest book, is that right? And I wondered if you could, we have, a couple minutes left. If you could give us a little introduction to that book and what you wanted to convey in those accounts.
Sure, yeah, thanks. Give me a chance to plug the most recent book. This is going to come out in the UK actually in about 2 weeks, and then it'll be available with Viking in the US next spring. And it's called Sailing Alone: A History. I went on one very small solo voyage across the Atlantic, and I can assure you it was not a feat of seamanship. It was a little bit of a bumbling expedition, but I did make it across and safely. That was in 2007. And so recently I wanted to think about how people who went to sea for long periods of time and far more efficiently than me by themselves saw the ocean in that same way of sort of tracing the history of the ocean over time and tracing the perception of the ocean over time. And so I really looked chronologically at different mariners who went to sea. That it included sailors that crossed the Pacific, that crossed the Atlantic, that went around the world. And maybe I could share one of my favorites, who's Kenichi Hori, who is at just two summers ago. He left out of San Francisco at 83 years old and crossed the North Atlantic by himself in a 19-foot boat. Sailed under the Golden Gate Bridge, and off he went and arrived in Tokyo safely several weeks later.
Well, thank you. And we're just about out of time. So I wanted to thank all of you so much for being on the program. It's been a real pleasure. Richard King, Mallory Hoffbeck, and Mia Hines, thank you so much for coming for this interview.
Thank you, Len.
And good luck with all your work upcoming.
Thanks very much.
Thank you so much.